Thanks for tuning in for day 5 of our 4th anniversary celebration. And as we've mentioned before, if you haven't yet signed up for our June 10th launch party, do it now. We'll be unveiling a really exciting new Japanese whiskey, and by signing up, you'll get the chance to see it first. Simply click the link below to save your spot now. Today we'll be talking about a distillery that might not be on your radar. Now, if you really know your Japanese whiskey, then you've probably heard of Mars Shinshu, or perhaps you've even tried it. But for the majority of whiskey enthusiasts in the West, it's not quite as well recognized as Suntory and Nikka, which is a real shame. Although far smaller in scale compared to the two Japanese giants, it does nonetheless make top-notch whiskey. For example, the Mars Maltage 3+25, a 28-year-old blend, was selected as the world's best blended whiskey at the World Whiskey Awards in 2013, a real testament to the quality of the company's products, followed by many additional awards in the years that have followed, even bringing home the title of Best Japanese Single Cask Single Malt at the 2019 World Whiskey Awards, beating out the big boys of Japanese whiskey. While the company's whiskey lineup isn't quite as extensive as Suntory and Nikka's, what it doesn't have in terms of quantity, it more than makes up for with quality. Each of the releases produced by Mars are world class, even if they might not be found in many whiskey cabinets outside of Japan, something that we'd love to see change. Before we dig into the background of the distillery, we want to note that it is commonly referred to under a variety of names. Technically, the name of the distillery is Shinshu, and it's operated by a company named Hanbo Shuzo. The name of the whiskey produced is called Mars. This can all be quite confusing, which is why we simply prefer to call it Mars Shinshu, or just Mars for short. Let's talk a little more about the background of the Mars Shinshu Distillery. There is a bit of a background story where Mars Shinshu is concerned. In 1918, Masataka Teketsuru was sent to Scotland by Setsu Breweries to study the whiskey-making process. He returned in 1920 and submitted a report, usually called the Teketsuru Notes. Setsu, the company that sponsored Teketsuru, had intended to produce whiskey, but they were having financial difficulties at the time. As a result, Teketsuru resigned from Setsu, went over to Suntory, and founded Japan's first distillery, Yamazaki, before establishing Nikka. However, Teketsuru's boss at Setsu, Awai Kilcharo, was passionate about making whiskey, and soon after, a friend of his recruited him as an advisor to Hanbu Breweries. In 1949, the company acquired a license to make whiskey, and then in 1960, a whiskey division was created. Awai used the information from the Teketsuru Notes in order to supervise the construction of a whiskey distillery. This first distillery was built in the Yamanashi Prefecture, a short distance from Tokyo. However, the distillery didn't take off as expected. This isn't to say there was anything wrong with its whiskey. It was heavy and smoky, just like good Scotch tends to be. But at the time, its style wasn't popular with Japanese consumers who preferred something more mellow and sweet. After 9 years of operating in the red, the distillery was converted into a winery. A few years later, following a boom in demand for whiskey, the company started making whiskey at their headquarters in Kagoshima, the southernmost tip of Japan. The location with a hot and humid climate wasn't exactly ideal for whiskey, but as this was where the company's operations were, and as whiskey was more of a side project at the time, this is where their whiskey was made. As sales began to grow, it was clear to Mars that if they were serious about making whiskey in the long term, then they had to find a better environment to make whiskey. As such, they began searching for a more permanent location in the early 1980s. The timing, of course, wasn't a coincidence, as the 1980s was a good time to be Japanese. The economy was booming, Japanese companies were buying half the world, and analysts were predicting that Japan would become the largest economy on the planet. The Japanese were partying like never before and enjoying their success. There were even stories of people drinking wine sprinkled with gold in Tokyo. Whiskey makers rode high as well, as there was enormous demand for premium spirits, and Mars intended to capitalize on this. The search for a new distillery location was finally fruitful in 1985 when the Shinshu Distillery was opened in the small village of Miyata in Nagano Prefecture. At an altitude of 798 meters, it claimed title to the second highest distillery in Japan, second only to Karazawa Distillery at the time. The cold winters, moderate summers, low humidity, and high-quality water supply from aquifers fed by the melting snow made the area an ideal location for whiskey production. The company used pot stills moved from the Yamanashi plant that were designed by Kilcharo Iwai himself based on the records left by Masataka Teketsuru. In fact, the pot stills closely resemble the straight head stills used at the Yochi distillery. For the first couple of years, sales were booming, but by 1990, the party was over. The Japanese economy stagnated and demand for whiskey dropped dramatically. The domestic population was moving towards other drinks like sochu, beer, and the sexier Scotch whiskeys. This was enough for Mars, being a relatively young player in the field, to halt production completely in 1992, presumably for good. Then, to everyone's surprise, it reopened in 2011. After a nearly 2-decade hiatus, it was back in business, passionate and ready to never shut its doors again. It has been creating amazing whiskey ever since. In order to celebrate Mars Shinshu, let's take a look at 5 of our favorite releases. At number 1 is Mars Kamagate's Single Cask 10th Anniversary 29-year-old Limited Edition. This is a whiskey you can't even find in Japan, as it sold out approximately 60 seconds after release. The product page went live on the website of Japan liquor store chain Shinanoya and was gone in an instant. The popularity of this bottling was expected, as it is a true piece of Japanese whiskey history. This single cask that Shinanoya managed to acquire due to their long, prosperous relationship with the distillery was distilled in 1988 when the distillery was still young. Such releases are very rare, as the distillery blends much of their older casks with young stock to create balanced blended expressions. Featuring the famous dragon from Shinshu's museum on the label, this is one of the rarest whiskeys in the world. At number 2 is Mars Single Cask Kamagate 1990, 27-year-old, cask number 1040. Winner of the Best Japanese Single Cask Single Malt at the 2019 World Whiskey Awards, this bottle is one of the best to come from Mars Distillery. It is composed of 4 ultra-rare single malt barrels, 3 of which are from 1988 or earlier, while the 4th is from 1990. Just 1,286 bottles were produced, which all were allocated by lottery prior to release. Judges have described the flavor as well balanced with notes of seaweed, citrus, peat, mushroom, and cereal, all topped off by notes of dirty peat and bacon that make it pack a punch. This is truly a top shelf release that any whiskey collector would love to own. At number 3 is Mars Kamagate's Double Cellars 2019. This is an interesting bottle in that although all the liquid was distilled at the Mars Shinshu Distillery, some of the liquid was matured at the company's Tsuniki location. Comprising whiskey matured in both areas, the name Double Cellars sort of speaks for itself. This 2019 edition has a nose of bitter chocolate and apricot, featuring spice, saltiness, citrus, and cookies in the palate, with a sweet vanilla finish. At number 4 is Mars Maltage 3+25 28-year-old pure malt. This Mars Maltage 28-year-old is one of Mars Shinshu's elite bottles. It was selected as the best Japanese blended malt whiskey at the World Whiskey Awards in 2013, beating out some very high caliber runner-ups and igniting interest in Mars Shinshu whiskey around the globe. If you've ever tried it, you know why it's been so successful. This is a whiskey that truly proves that Mars can compete with the big boys, such as Nikka and Suntory. And at number 5, Mars Biker Journey 2019. A limited edition of only 688 bottles from Mars, released exclusively for the Two-Stroke Biker Club in Taiwan. The whiskey is an exquisite blended malt presented in a beautiful collectible bottle that's accompanied by a custom-designed handbag and postcard. While traveling on your bike, you can send the postcard to your loved ones to share the adventure spurred on by this fabulous whiskey. Thanks for tuning in today for this brief introduction to the fabulous whiskey from Mars Shinshu. We hope to see you back tomorrow.